There is a line that was removed. It comes from one of the oldest flood narratives in human history, a cuneiform text pressed into clay approximately 600 years ago in a city called Sippur by a scribe whose name we know. His name was Ipik Aya. The line he copied, which someone else had composed centuries before him, read in Stephanie Daly's translation, the Anunnaki. The great gods were sitting in thirst and hunger, the gods who had ordered the flood, the divine council who had voted in formal assembly for the extinction of humanity, sitting on the walls of heaven, hungry, afraid of what they themselves had done, dependent visibly, embarrassingly dependent on the humans they were in the process of drowning. Because those humans had been the ones providing their food offerings, and the food offerings had stopped because the humans were underwater. That line survived in the version of the flood story scholars called the Atrahasis epic. When the same flood narrative was retold in the Gilgamesh epic, the more famous text, the one that ended up in the Great Library at Nineveh, the line was gone. In its place, the gods feared the deluge, dignified, appropriate, no hunger, no dependence, no divine assembly sitting in the consequences of its own decision. In 1982, the scholar Geoffrey Tigay published a study called The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic. His analysis placed the two flood narratives side by side and demonstrated that the changes between them were not accidental. They were directional. Every revision moved the same way, away from divine vulnerability toward divine authority. The gods who sat hungry became gods who simply feared. The gods who were afraid of what they had done became gods who were appropriately awed by the scale of it. One line changed across 3,500 years of transmission. That is where this investigation begins, not with a hidden conspiracy, not with ancient priests burning records in the dark, but with a named scribe, a specific editorial comparison, and a documented pattern. Because what Tigay found in the gap between two flood narratives is not an isolated anomaly, it is a signature. And once you know what the signature looks like, you start finding it in other places. When the gods went on strike, the Atrahasis epic does not begin with a flood, it begins with a labour dispute. The opening lines of Tablet 1 establish a world divided between two classes of gods: the Anunnaki, the Senior Council, the Great Assembly. The figures associated with cosmic authority sit in oversight. The Igigi, the lesser gods, the subordinate tier, do the actual work. They dig the watercourses. They cut the channels that carry water to the agricultural land between the Tigris and Euphrates. They maintain the irrigation infrastructure that makes civilization possible. For 40 years, the text tells us, the Igigi carry this load. Then, in language that does not require much translation to recognize, they reach a collective breaking point. The tablet records, the load is excessive, it is killing us, our work is too hard, the trouble too much. The Igigi stop digging. They burn their tools. They march at night to the house of Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, the lord of the divine assembly, the god whose command governed the cosmos, and they surround it. They set fire to their spades and their baskets. They arrive armed. Enlil is asleep. The noise wakes him. What happens next is one of the more politically complex sequences in the entire Sumerian and Akkadian textual tradition, and it has received far less attention than the flood story that follows it. Enlil convenes an emergency session of the Anunnaki. The divine assembly is called in the middle of the night, and the text records something that should stop anyone who has been told the Anunnaki were an all-powerful unified divine monarchy, Enlil is frightened. The text says so explicitly. The most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon, the one Samuel Noah Kramer described in his foundational 1944 study Sumerian mythology as the god who actually rules the universe, does not know what to do. He turns to his father Anu and to Enki, the god of wisdom, and asks for options. Anu returns to heaven, the patriarch of the entire divine hierarchy. When confronted with an armed rebellion by the lesser gods, simply goes home. It is Enki who proposes the solution. The Igigi need labour relief. The Anunnaki need the Igigi to stop surrounding Enlil's house with burning tools. Enki's proposal, which Enlil accepts, is the creation of humanity. New beings mixed from clay and the blood of a lesser god, executed specifically for this purpose, who will perform the labour the Igigi have refused. The cosmic standoff ends. The divine assembly disperses. The cosmos returns to order. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis epic is not an act of divine generosity. It is a management solution to a labour rebellion. That reading is not fringe. Lambert and Millard's 1969 critical edition establishes it from the primary text. Daly's translation makes it accessible, and what it establishes before the flood, before everything else, is that the Anunnaki Council had already demonstrated that it could be pressured, that it contained dissenting factions, that its most senior member preferred absence to confrontation, that the cosmos humans were created into was not a stable divine monarchy, but an institution that had just survived its first internal crisis by outsourcing the problem. There is one detail in this rebellion narrative that has never left me since I first encountered it in Lambert and Millard's edition. When the Igigi surround Enlil's house and wake him, his first response is not anger. He sends his minister Nusku to the door to ask, and the text is precise about this, what the matter is. The Lord of the Divine Assembly, the God whose command could not be altered, sends a diplomat to a crowd of gods holding burning tools and asks what they need. That detail survived the transmission. The image of Enlil standing behind his door while Nusku went out to negotiate, that survived, which raises a question the script has already prepared you to ask. What else might have been in the earlier versions that did not? The architecture of forgetting the oldest surviving copy of the Atrahasis epic carries a scribal identification note pressed into the clay at the end of the text. It names Ipik Aya. It dates the copy to the reign of Ammisaduqa, great-grandson of Hammurabi, somewhere between 1646 and 1626 BC. That note is worth pausing over, not because it tells us when the text was written, but because of what it confirms about the transmission. The tradition Ipik Aya was recording was already old when he pressed his stylus into the clay. He was copying a version that was itself centuries removed from the composition's origin. What we have is not the beginning of the story. We have a particular scribe's copy of a version already deep into its editorial life. This is the defining condition of Mesopotamian literary study. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades working with the Nippur tablet collections at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, stated it plainly in Sumerian mythology. The texts he was working from were often late copies of earlier originals, with numerous breaks and scribal errors. He was not being pessimistic, he was being accurate. The institution that controlled that transmission was the Aduba, the Sumerian house of tablets, the scribal school. And the Aduba was not a repository of all available knowledge. It was a selective institution with a pedagogical curriculum, and that curriculum reflected the theological and political priorities of the cities and dynasties that funded it. What the schools preserved, they preserved in the forms the school authorities approved. What complicated those forms faced a different fate. The specific mechanism of this process is important to understand precisely, because understanding it precisely is what separates this investigation from the genre that surrounds it. When a Babylonian scribe copied an older text, they were not transcribing blindly. They were trained philologists who made decisions about variant readings, about which source to follow when multiple copies disagreed, about how to handle lines that seemed theologically awkward. The scribal correction marks visible on some Nippur tablets are evidence of active editorial engagement, not passive transmission. What Tigoy's analysis demonstrated is that the changes between Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh flood narrative were directional. That is not the pattern of accidental damage. Accidental damage does not have a consistent direction. A text that is damaged at random produces random results. A text whose changes consistently move away from divine vulnerability and toward divine authority has been shaped by something other than accident. The scribes who made these changes were not, in most cases, executing an institutional order to hide a divine war. They were engaged in theological refinement, making divine figures more consistent with the elevated conception of divine nature that characterized increasingly sophisticated Mesopotamian theology. Gods who sit in hunger are embarrassingly dependent. Gods who fear a storm maintain a kind of grandeur. The revisions served a purpose the scribes, who made it probably considered an improvement. But the cumulative effect across centuries of such improvements was this: the record of what the divine assembly had actually been like in its oldest surviving depiction, frightened, divided, hungry, outvoted, capable of being pressured, became progressively harder to see. The Iduba scribal tradition included a category of text called the Dubsar, the Tablet of the Scribes, which recorded ideal models of scribal conduct. In these texts, the good scribe is praised for faithful copying, for not altering what the teacher had written. The school system simultaneously trained scribes to copy faithfully and placed them in a tradition where every generation of faithful copiers was working from versions the previous generation of faithful copiers had already revised. Fidelity in a living textual tradition is a moving target, and the direction that target moved across the centuries this investigation is examining was consistent. The bird that stole authority in the early 20th century, excavators working at the ancient site of Susa in what is now southwestern Iran found a cuneiform tablet that told a story scholars already knew, but told it differently in ways that turned out to matter considerably. The story was the myth of Anzu. Most people who encounter it know the standard Babylonian version, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. In that version, the divine storm bird Anzu, described in cuneiform texts as half eagle and half lion, the personification of the southern wind and the thunderclouds, waits for the moment when Enlil goes to bathe, seizes the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil's sanctuary, and carries it to a mountain stronghold. The Tablet of Destinies is not simply a royal document. Andrew George, in his 1986 paper in the journal Iraq, established that in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking this object was the instrument of cosmic authority itself impressed with cylinder seals, functioning as a legal contract. The holder of the tablet held the right to decree fate. When Anzu steals it from Enlil, the theft is not a robbery, it is a coup. The entire mechanism of cosmic governance is suspended because its legal foundation is in the wrong hands. The Anunnaki panic. Champions are nominated to retrieve the tablet and are, one by one, frightened into refusal. Finally, Ninurta, warrior son of Enlil, god of spring thunder showers, accepts the challenge, defeats Anzu, and returns the tablet to its rightful place. Order is restored. The divine hierarchy is reaffirmed. That is the standard Babylonian version. Clean, purposeful, a clear narrative of cosmic authority challenged and restored. The creature's name itself carries an instability the scholarly record has never fully resolved. Thorkild Jacobson argued in 1989 that the original Sumerian pronunciation was probably Dim.Dugud, meaning heavy wind or heavy rain cloud, with the form Anzu being a later Akkadian variant that gradually displaced the older name. A storm stole the right to govern fate. The creature and the act were named with the same word. The old Babylonian version from Susa, now held in the Louvre, tells a related but meaningfully different story. Stephanie Daly noted in her 2000 edition of Myths from Mesopotamia that this text is the oldest Akkadian transmission of the Anzu narrative. In it, the hero is not Ninurta, but Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, a deity who was subsequently absorbed into or identified with Ninurta as that god's cult spread from Nippur. The shift from Ningirsu to Ninurta is a political act encoded in the transmission. One city's divine champion erased from the hero role and replaced by another city's. But the shift in the hero's identity is not the most striking difference between the versions. In the Susa text, the hero's conduct is not straightforwardly heroic. Jacobson identified a tension in the character and ambivalence in the relationship between the divine son and his father's authority that the standard Babylonian version removes entirely. In the later canonical version, Ninurta is a loyal champion undertaking a sanctioned mission. In the earlier version, something more complicated is happening. A divine son, whose loyalties are not entirely aligned with the authority he is defending, is fighting to restore an authority he may not fully believe in. There is something else to hold from this moment, something the next section of this investigation will make suddenly significant. Ninurta retrieves the Tablet of Destinies. He defeats the creature that stole cosmic authority. He holds in his hands the legal instrument that determines who governs the divine order. What he does next is what the canonical version does not dwell on. Two heroes, one battle, incompatible stories. Thorkild Jacobson proposed something in his 1976 study, The Treasures of Darkness, that has never been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of this mythology, and it is worth stating directly. In the oldest recoverable layer of the Sumerian tradition, before the cuneiform texts had encoded its fixed form, Anzu and Ninurta were not opponents. They were aspects of the same divine figure. The storm bird and the warrior who fought it, the monster and the hero, were, in the theological stratum beneath the surviving texts, a single deity, the storm that both destroyed and renewed, that simultaneously challenged order and restored it. That was the threat and the response to the threat at once. The evidence Jacobson cited included a sculptural object from the Tel Asmar hoard, excavated by the Oriental Institute of Chicago between 1933 and 1934, and now held in the Oriental Institute Museum. Among the hoard's votive statuettes, one carries an Anzu bird carved onto its base beneath a human-formed divine figure. Jacobson's interpretation was that this depicted the deity in two simultaneous registers, the human divine form above and the storm bird symbolic form below. At the moment this object was made, the god and the creature that later myths would position as enemies were understood as a unified divine personality. One being, one storm, two faces of the same force. What the canonical Anzu myth achieved was a theological separation. The original unified divine figure, simultaneously creative and destructive, simultaneously threatening and defending, was split into two distinct characters. The monster received one half of the original nature, the heroism received the other. The resulting narrative is tidier, more morally legible, and far less theologically complicated. The divine war it depicts is clean. Hero defeats monster. Order is restored. The assembly celebrates. The original myth, if Jacobson's reconstruction is accepted even provisionally, was about something more unsettling, a divine force that was its own enemy, a cosmic power that threatened and defended the same thing, a god whose storm both destroyed and made possible the agricultural world that Mesopotamian civilization depended on. The separation of that figure into hero and monster made the war legible. It also made it smaller than it had been stripped of the internal contradiction that had been the original theological point. The Susa tablet preserves a trace of what was lost in that separation, a hero whose relationship to the authority he is defending is ambivalent, a divine son not entirely aligned with his father's governance. The standard Babylonian version resolved that ambivalence into unambiguous loyalty. The earlier version left the tension visible. And then Ninurta came home holding the Tablet of Destinies, a war recorded on 80 tablets, each one different the Lugal, whose full Sumerian title begins Lugal Iudmilumbi Nil, meaning roughly O King. The aura of whose splendour is overpowering is among the oldest epic compositions in the Sumerian literary tradition. Its origins, as Jan van Dijk established in his authoritative 1983 edition, lie somewhere in the late 3rd millennium BC. The composition runs to approximately 728 lines across what were originally up to 13 tablets. Its subject is Ninurta, his battle against the demon Asag, and the Asag's army of rebellious stones, his reconstruction of the rivers after the war's end, his judgment of the stones that had fought against him, and his return to Nippur to receive his father's praise. It survives in more than 80 cuneiform exemplars. Sources from the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, the Ashmolean in Oxford, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, collections in London, Jena, New Haven. The textual record of this divine war is distributed across 4 continents worth of museum holdings. 64 of those 80 exemplars came from Nippur alone, Ninurta's home city. The Lugal-E was a central text of the Nippur scribal school curriculum, copied and recopied by generations of students learning their craft. Its proliferation is a function of institutional importance, and that institutional importance is its self-evidence. Ninurta's war against cosmic disorder was among the most significant mythological events in the Sumerian theological imagination. Now to what M.J. Geller identified in his 1985 analysis in the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. Those 80 exemplars show considerable textual variance. Not trivial variance, different sign forms, minor spelling differences, the kinds of errors that afflict any hand-transmitted text. Substantive variance. And it is concentrated in one specific section. The war itself, Ninurta's battle, and his victory is relatively stable across exemplars. The Stone Judgment passage, which records what happens after the war, who is punished, how, on what authority, with what cosmic consequences, is textually the most unstable part of the composition. Van Dyck's critical edition had to work from multiple divergent exemplars even for single lines of this section. Geller's additional Old Babylonian sources diverged from Van Dyck's composite precisely within the Stone Judgment passage: what the war meant, what it cost, what authority it produced, and for whom. These are the questions the 80 tablets cannot agree on. Here is the thing to hold alongside that: the Asag, the demon Ninurta defeats in the Lugal-E, is described as leading an army of stones who have tired of Ninurta's allocating tasks. The rebellious stones have refused their labour assignments. They have rejected the authority structure that governed them. The divine war in the Lugal-E is not against a random evil force. It is against beings who have decided not to comply with the cosmic labour arrangement, the same structural act as the Igigi rebellion in the Atrahasis epic, now appearing at a different scale, in a different medium, with a different cast. The Igigi burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's house. The stones took up arms against Ninurta. Both rebellions were suppressed by force. Both were followed by restructuring of the cosmic labour arrangement, and in both, the suppression did not fully resolve the underlying tensions. The Igigi were relieved by the creation of humanity. The stones were individually sentenced in a passage that 80 cuneiform copies cannot render consistently. The institution that preserved the Lugal-E was the Nippur Scribal School. The institution that funded and maintained that school had a direct interest in how Ninurta's authority, and specifically how the consequences of his war, was characterized. Different exemplars from different institutional sponsors produced different versions of the passage that recorded those consequences. The war is stable. The cost of the war is contested. That is not the pattern of a tradition faithfully transmitting a settled account. That is the pattern of a tradition still working out what the account was supposed to say. The kingdom that wasn't there, the clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford Inventory number 1923. 444, approximately 20 centimetres tall, its four faces inscribed with 8 columns of cuneiform records the kings who ruled the cities of Sumer from the moment kingship descended from heaven to the dynasty that controlled southern Mesopotamia when the prism was inscribed. This is the Weld Blundell prism, the most complete surviving exemplar of the Sumerian king list. Thorkild Jacobson published the standard critical edition in 1939. His analysis established something confirmed by every subsequent study: the king list is not a historical document in any modern sense. It is a political argument. Specifically, it argues that kingship in Sumer was a singular divine ordained institution that passed sequentially from one city to another, as the gods decreed, such that at any given moment only one city legitimately held the mandate of heaven, and all previous legitimate rulers traced in an unbroken line to the moment divine authority first descended to earth. The dynasty that produced the king list's canonical form was the third dynasty of Ur. The political purpose is transparent. By constructing a genealogy of legitimate kingship that culminated in Ur, the Ur three kings legitimized their authority as heirs to an unbroken tradition. The problem is what the list leaves out. The first dynasty of Lagash is absent from the Weld Blundell prism. Consider what the archaeological record tells us about Lagash. The city's own royal inscriptions, recovered from excavations at the site of Girsu, now distributed between the Louvre and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, document a dynasty spanning roughly 2570 to 2342 BC. These rulers left inscription after inscription, dedicatory texts, administrative records, hymns. The Stele of the Vultures, held at the Louvre, depicts the military victory of the Lagashite ruler Eannatum over the city of Ummah, in carved relief, one of the earliest historical records of organised military conflict in human history. Urukagina of Lagos produced reform inscriptions containing the oldest surviving written reference to concepts of freedom, law reform, and protection of the poor from exploitation. These people existed, their cities were real, their wars were documented in stone. They do not appear in the king list. Jacobson's analysis identified the mechanism. Lagash's rulers used the title NC governor or administrator rather than Lugal, the term the king list framework required for inclusion. The III scribal authors could exclude Lagash on a definitional technicality while suppressing a dynasty whose power and cultural achievement were beyond question. What the Lagash omission demonstrates, and why it matters beyond its own significance, is this: the scribal tradition responsible for the king list was willing to excise from the historical record entire political entities, entire dynasties, entire sequences of real and documented events, when those entities complicated the political theology the document was designed to promote. We can verify the deletion because we have independent archaeological evidence. We can measure the gap between what happened and what the cuneiform record chose to preserve. If the scribal apparatus that produced the king list could delete Lagash, a city with enormous archaeological visibility, what might the same tradition's predecessors and successors have adjusted in the mythological texts that recorded the history of the divine world, where we have no independent ground to measure the gap? The photograph that waited 69 years in 1956, Samuel Noah Kramer published History Begins at Sumer. On its cover, he placed a photograph of a cuneiform tablet from the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, catalogue number NI 1501, one of the Nippur collection tablets recovered from the Ottoman-era excavation share of the University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur between 1889 and 1900. The tablet's surface was clearly visible in the photograph. Its signs were legible to anyone trained to read cuneiform. Kramer knew it was there. Scholars who came after him knew it was there. The photograph appeared on one of the most widely read books about Sumerian civilization published in the 20th century. For 69 years, no one published a complete translation of what it said. Not because it was hidden, not because an institution decided the contents were dangerous, because the work of reading several thousand cuneiform tablets sitting in museum collections across 4 continents takes time, requires rare specialist knowledge, and has never attracted the resources the scale of the task demands. The tablets sat in Istanbul, saying something to no one, while the photograph of it sat on bookshelves in universities and living rooms around the world. In 2025, Jana Matusak, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, published a full translation of NI 12501 in the journal Iraq. The tablet, as her translation revealed, contains a Sumerian myth with no parallel in the currently known corpus, a unique composition that the scribal tradition recorded and that no subsequent scribal school found important enough to copy into multiple exemplars. It survived in this one tablet in Istanbul for nearly 4,000 years, and then for 69 more on the cover of a book before anyone read it in full. The archive is not closed, it is not even fully open. The Penn Museum's nipple holdings still contain material that has been catalogued but not fully worked into the scholarly literature. The Istanbul collections hold thousands of tablets from the Ottoman excavation share, many never fully published. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which lost significant holdings during the 2003 looting, though substantial material was subsequently recovered, holds pre-war excavation material from sites across Mesopotamia that has never been fully catalogued. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative at Oxford continues the ongoing project of digitising and making accessible tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets held in collections worldwide. What the investigation assembled here draws from is the material that has been sufficiently worked to yield clear evidence. Behind that material lies an unknown quantity of material that has not. NI 12501 is proof of what that means in practice. A tablet photographed in 1956, sitting in plain sight, waiting until 2025 to say what it contained. The clay does not forget. It waits for the right kind of attention. The War After the War There is a text that does not appear in most popular treatments of Sumerian mythology. It has been in the ACSL database since the Oxford project catalogued it. Stephanie Daly discusses the tradition in myths from Mesopotamia. It appears infrequently in popular accounts, partly because it is fragmentary, partly because it requires familiarity with the Anzu narrative to be fully legible, and partly because what it describes is genuinely awkward for anyone who wants to present the Anunnaki as a unified, harmonious divine institution. The text is called Ninurta and the Turtle. It begins after the Anzu battle. Ninurta has defeated the divine Stormbird. He has retrieved the Tablet of Destinies. The canonical Anzu narrative emphasises, at this point, the hero's triumphant return to Enlil's court, his vindication, his celebrated status as the divine champion who restored cosmic order. Ninurta and the Turtle picks up the narrative at a different point, not the triumph. What Ninurta apparently did next with what he had won. The text describes Ninurta attempting to claim the Tablet of Destinies for himself. Having retrieved it from Anzu rather than returning it to Enlil, the loyal champion, the hero of the cosmic war, tries to keep it. Enki finds out. The god of wisdom, who in the Atrahasis narrative had undermined Enlil's flood decree while maintaining its formal appearance, now acts against Ninurta. Enki fashions a turtle from the clay of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that is his domain, and places it at an opening where Ninurta will encounter it. The turtle traps Ninurta in a pit. Enki approaches the trapped warrior god and, according to the ACCSL translation, mocks him. You who set out to seize what was not yours. You who attempted to take the fate of heaven and earth, look at you now. The text breaks off. We do not know how Ninurta gets out of the pit. The composition is fragmentary and the resolution did not survive in the copies that reached us. This text is a documentation of an intra-Anunnaki conflict, not between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, not between the Divine Council and an external monster, between two of the most senior figures in the Sumerian Divine Assembly, Ninurta, son of Enlil, the warrior who had just restored cosmic order, and Enki, the god of wisdom, who had been working around Enlil's authority since before humans existed. The war after the cosmic war is between the hero and the figure who kept subverting the decision-maker the hero was supposedly defending. The Tablet of Destinies reappears here, and its reappearance clarifies something the canonical Anzu narrative had compressed into a clean, heroic frame. The tablet was not simply a cosmic object that needed to be kept away from monsters, it was the instrument of governance, and the hero who retrieved it was unwilling to give it up. Anzu had stolen authority, Ninurta had taken it back. And then, for a moment preserved in fragmentary form in a text the popular tradition almost never discusses, Ninurta had tried to keep it. The divine assembly is not, in this composite picture, an institution that successfully polices its own members through legitimate authority. It is a body of powerful competing agents, each with distinct interests, distinct domains, distinct ideas about who should hold what, whose internal conflicts produced both the creation of humanity and the vote to destroy it, whose hero could become a usurper within the same narrative arc, and whose chief executive was frightened enough by a labour rebellion to send a diplomat to his own door rather than exercise his authority directly. The picture that emerges from placing these texts beside each other is only visible as a composite. No single text contains it whole. The scribal tradition did not prevent that reading. It merely arranged the texts so that no individual composition contained the full image. The composite had to be assembled from fragments. Whether that fragmentation was deliberate or incidental, whether the architecture was designed or merely accumulated, is a question the evidence cannot fully answer. The fragmentation itself may be, in part, the architecture. The assembly that voted for extinction the flood in the Atrahasis epic is not Enlil's unilateral decision. The text records the assembly of the Anunnaki in formal session, hearing the case and agreeing. The vote to destroy humanity is collective. The Divine Council, sitting in its full institutional authority, resolves to end the species it had created to perform the labour the Igigi had refused. But the resolution is not unanimous in the way its formal record suggests. Enki is in that assembly. He hears the decree. He takes the oath, along with every other god, to keep the flood plan secret from humanity. The oath is collective. The silence is formally binding. And then Enki goes to the reed hut where his priest Atrahasis sleeps, and he speaks not to Atrahasis, but to the walls of the hut, telling the walls, not the man, what is coming and how to survive it. Technically, the letter of his oath is preserved. He has not spoken directly to a human. In substance, he has told the human everything. This is not a story about divine mercy. It is a story about a god who was outvoted, who accepted the assembly's decision in public form, and who was simultaneously working to undermine it using a legal fiction that maintained its appearance while hollowing out its effect. The Anunnaki assembly, in the flood narrative, is an institution containing at least one of its most powerful members who participated in a collective decision while privately planning its subversion. The extinction that was voted for unanimously was being worked against by a member of the body that voted for it. The Divine Council's resolution was, from the moment of its passage, already being circumvented from the inside. Now recall the line that was removed. The Anunnaki, the great gods, were sitting in thirst and hunger. The flood is underway. The agricultural activity that produced the food offerings that sustained the gods has stopped. The gods who voted to destroy humanity are suffering the immediate consequences of that vote, sitting on the walls of heaven, hungry, dependent on the species they are in the process of drowning. The Gilgamesh version replaces this with gods who simply fear the deluge. The revision removes from the flood narrative the moment when the divine assembly's collective decision produces visible, immediate costs for the assembly itself. The hunger in the Atrahasis version is the mark of a governing body that voted for something without fully understanding what they were voting for, that the humans who disturbed them with their noise were also the humans who fed them, and that solving the noise problem by drowning its source would eliminate the sustenance by the same mechanism. That is what was removed, not just a line about hunger, a portrait of a divine assembly that had acted and was sitting in the consequences of its own action that had to be rescued not by its own wisdom, but by the descent of one of its members. The flood ends. Atrahasis builds an altar. The food offerings resume. The Anunnaki descend to the sacrifice, the text says. Like flies, the same insect image used to describe their suffering during the deluge, now applied to their eagerness for the food that has returned. The gods who voted for extinction are immediately, visibly dependent on the survival. Enlil, discovering that Atrahasis lived, is furious with Enki. Enki defends himself. The assembly does not reconvene. The conflict between the two gods running since before humans existed, expressed through the plagues and the famines and the flood, never resolved, never formally adjudicated, simply continues. The Divine Council voted for extinction. One member subverted the vote. The species survived. The conflict that produced the vote goes on. The institution did not resolve its own crisis. It outsourced the resolution to a dissenter and then argued about it afterward. The archive that keeps translating itself in 2025, Jana Matusak, sat down with Ni 12501, the tablet photographed on the cover of Kramer's 1956 book, sitting in Istanbul for 69 years, and published what it said. The composition she translated had no parallel in the known Sumerian corpus, a unique mythological text recorded once, copied by no scribal school into the canonical curriculum, surviving in a single tablet in a collection that had been accessible to scholars for more than a century. It said something to no one for all of that time. And then it said something. That is what the phrase finally surfacing means in the context of this investigation. Not a dramatic revelation from a sealed chamber, not a discovery made in opposition to institutional authority, a tablet that was there that required specialist attention of a kind that takes decades to develop and time that is difficult to fund, and that yielded its content when that attention was finally brought to it. The archive that contains this evidence is not closed. The Penn Museum holds Nippur material that has been catalogued but never fully published. The Istanbul collections contain thousands of tablets from the Ottoman excavation share of the same Nippur expeditions material distributed in the late 19th century, some of which has never been the subject of full scholarly translation. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds pre-war excavation material from sites across Mesopotamia, significant portions of which remain unpublished despite the recovery work done after 2003. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative at Oxford is still in the process of digitising and making accessible tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets held in institutions around the world. What this investigation has assembled is drawn from the material sufficiently worked to yield clear evidence. The Atrahasis editorial changes documented by Tagai, the Susa Anzu version analysed by Daly, the Lugal-Ease textual variants identified by Geller, the Lagash omission from the king list established by Jacobson, Ninurta and the turtle in the CCSL database. These findings have existed in the scholarly literature for years, in some cases for decades. Placed beside each other, they form a pattern that the popular tradition has not always presented clearly, not because the evidence was hidden, but because reading it requires moving across multiple independent texts, multiple independent scribal traditions, and multiple independent centuries of editorial history simultaneously. Behind the material that has been worked lies an unknown quantity that has not. NE 12501 is not an anomaly, it is a representative case. A tablet known, photographed, accessible and unread in full for 69 years is a measure of how large the gap between in a collection and fully understood can be in this archive. The work of closing that gap is ongoing. It moves slowly. It requires the kind of attention that does not produce results quickly and does not attract resources easily. And it keeps producing results like Matazak's 2025 translation specific, datable, genuinely new on a timeline that has no announced endpoint. What the clay remembers the Atrahasis tablet in the British Museum weighs less than you expect when you think about what it contains. The wedge marks pressed by Ipiq-Aya's stylers into soft clay somewhere in Sippur sometime between 1646 and 1626 BC are still clear. The slightly varying pressure of one groove against another, the places where the sign was pressed and then adjusted, where the clay holds the exact moment of a hand's decision, has not diminished in 3,600 years. Clay fired and dried holds its marks. The institution that employed Ipiq-Aya is gone. The city of Sippur is dust. The hand that held the stylus is gone many thousands of years. The marks remain. What the clay holds is a version of a story that was already old when Ipiq-Aya copied it, already edited, already shaped by the hands of the tradition that transmitted it, a version from which, as Lambert and Tigay would demonstrate across the following decades, specific content about divine hunger and divine fear and the consequences of collective divine decision would be removed when the story moved to a different city, a different institutional audience, a different theological framework. The picture assembled here from the Ijiji rebellion, from the Anzu coup, from the 80 exemplars of the Ninurta War that cannot agree on how the peace was settled, from the Lagash-shaped hole in the king list, from the trap Enki set for Ninurta in a pit, from the hunger written out of the flood narrative, from the tablet in Istanbul that waited until 2025 to say what it contained is partial. It is assembled from what survived. What survived is what the scribal tradition found worth preserving, in the forms the scribal tradition found tolerable across the centuries of revision that converted an older, more volatile mythological imagination into the structured, theologically dignified canonical system the first millennium Assyrian libraries preserved. The partial picture is coherent enough to say the oldest recoverable layer of the Sumerian divine record depicts a council of gods whose internal conflicts were severe, consequential, and politically complex, a labour rebellion that produced humanity, a coup attempt that nearly transferred cosmic authority to a storm, a war whose aftermath was still being contested across 80 different cuneiform copies, a heroic champion who attempted, immediately after his greatest victory, to keep what he had won, a flood voted for unanimously by an assembly that contained at least one member already working to undermine the vote, and gods who sat hungry on the walls of heaven, dependent on the humans they had tried to drown, in a line that someone eventually decided was not the right way to say it. The partial picture is also honest enough to say what it does not contain, the complete assembly record, if one ever existed. the traditions that did not make the Adaba canon, the compositions that survived only in collections, still waiting for the kind of sustained attention that turned Ni 12501 from a photograph on a book cover into a text with a translation. What the investigation has found is not a hidden wall. It is something more interesting than a hidden wall. It is the evidence of what a civilization found too complicated to say clearly, and what that same civilization, across centuries of scribal patience, found too important to entirely let go. The Divine Assembly's conflicts, the Divine Council's hunger, the hero's attempted coup, the dissenters' legal fiction, none of it was fully erased. It survived in fragments. In the older version kept at Susa, while a different version was being canonized at Nineveh. In the lines that stayed in the Atrahasis, while the Gilgamesh version dropped them. In the 80 exemplars that cannot agree on what the war cost. In a single tablet in Istanbul, waiting, the fragmentation itself may be, in part, the architecture. The tradition that could not say the whole thing clearly found ways to preserve the pieces in variant versions, in contested passages, in the gap between one text and the next, such that the whole thing remained recoverable by the kind of attention that assembles fragments rather than demanding monuments. Ipek Aya pressed his stylus into the clay and copied a version of a story he had been trained to copy faithfully. He was faithful to the version he had. The clay was faithful to him. And 600 years later, in a museum in London, in a collection in Istanbul, in a database in Oxford, in a journal article published in 2025, the fragments are still arriving. The assembly is not closed. The archive never was. The God who kept saying no there is a figure who moves through nearly every text this investigation has examined, and he never quite does what the situation expects of him. In the Atrahasis epic, he proposes the creation of humanity to end a divine labour crisis, and then spends the next several thousand years quietly undermining the authority of the assembly that accepted his proposal. In the Anzu myth, he is absent from the roster of champions, too frightened to retrieve the Tablet of Destinies, but present at the moment the retrieval creates a new problem. In Ninurta and the Turtle, he fashions a creature from clay to trap the divine hero who has just saved the cosmos. In the flood narrative, he takes an oath of collective silence and immediately finds a legal mechanism to break it without technically breaking it. His name is Enki. The scholarly literature on Enki is substantial. Thorkild Jacobsen devoted significant attention to him in The Treasures of Darkness, characterizing his divine personality as fundamentally playful, a trickster figure, the god of cleverness and fresh water and craft, the deity whose intelligence was always slightly ahead of the situation and whose solutions always contained a surplus of ingenuity that created new problems while solving old ones. Samuel Noah Kramer and John Mayer produced a full study of his mythology in 1989, Enki and the World Order, drawing on Sumerian literary texts from the Penn Museum Nippur collection to establish the scope of his divine domain, fresh water, crafts, magic, wisdom, the subterranean ocean called the Abzu, that was understood as the source of all fresh water in the world. What the scholarly literature on Enki has analysed carefully, and what the popular tradition has mostly missed, is the political structure of his descent. Enki does not rebel. He does not vote against assembly resolutions, at least not on the record. He does not defy Enlil's authority openly, does not challenge the divine hierarchy in the way the Igigi did, when they burned their tools and surrounded the chief executive's house. His disagreement with the direction of divine governance operates entirely through indirection, through legal fictions, through creative interpretations of what an oath requires, through solutions that technically comply with the rules of the divine assembly while functionally subverting its intent. He is, in the composite picture assembled from these texts, the most consistently dissenting voice in the Anunnaki Council, and his dissent is never formally recorded as such because it never takes the form of formal opposition. This matters for the investigation because Enki's mode of operation illuminates something about the divine assembly's actual structure that the texts never state directly. If the most senior member of the Anunnaki, who consistently disagreed with Enlil's decisions, was also the member who consistently found ways to work around those decisions without openly opposing them, then the Assembly's unanimous votes, its formal collective resolutions, mean something different from what they appear to mean. Unanimity in a body where the most powerful dissenter has learnt to comply formally while subverting practically is not consensus. It is the management of dissent through indirection. The flood vote was unanimous. Enki was present. He took the oath. He immediately subverted it. The question the text does not answer, and that the scribal tradition does not appear to have asked in any surviving composition, is whether this was the first time, whether the pattern of formal compliance and practical subversion that Enki exhibits in the flood narrative was a strategy he had developed across earlier divine assembly decisions that do not survive in the cuneiform record, whether the unanimous votes of the Anunnaki Council across the entire span of the mythological tradition were unanimous in the same way the formal record concealing a dissenting intelligence that had learned, across long institution experience, that open opposition was less effective than creative compliance. There is one text that approaches this question more directly than any other in the Sumerian corpus. It is not a war narrative, it is not a flood story, it is a composition scholars call the Eridu Genesis, and its relationship to the Atrahasis tradition has been debated since Thorkild Jacobson identified its significance in a 1981 paper in the Journal of Biblical Literature. The Eridu Genesis survives in a single fragmentary tablet, CBS 1673, held in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. It records a Sumerian language version of the creation and flood narrative that predates the Atrahasis epic in certain compositional features, while sharing its basic architecture. Jacobson's analysis established that the Eridu Genesis preserves elements of the flood tradition that the Atrahasis version had already modified, making it, in certain respects, a window into a stratum of the narrative older than the oldest version of the story most people know. In the Eridu Genesis, the divine decision to send the flood is presented differently from the Atrahasis account. The assembly does not deliberate at length. The resolution is compressed, and Enki's role in subverting it is, if anything, more opaque than in the Atrahasis. The tablet is fragmentary enough that the mechanism of Atrahasis's survival is not fully preserved. What is preserved is the outline of a familiar structure: divine decision, human survival, divine aftermath. But in a form that suggests the later Atrahasis epic had already elaborated and politicized a narrative that was originally simpler and perhaps less interested in the mechanics of divine disagreement. What the Eridu Genesis offers, in other words, is evidence that the political texture of the Atrahasis flood, narrative the formal vote, the oath, Enki's legal fiction. The god sitting hungry was not part of the tradition's earliest recoverable layer. It was added or elaborated in the process of the tradition's development. Someone found it important to specify that the flood was a collective decision. Someone found it important to describe Enki's subversion in precise legal terms. Someone found it important to record the god's hunger. These additions are the investigation's most significant editorial layer, not subtractions but accretions. The older version, simpler, less politically detailed, was elaborated by scribes who found the political mechanics important enough to specify. And then the later version, the Gilgamesh flood, removed some of what those elaborating scribes had added, particularly the divine hunger. The tradition moved from simple to complex to partially simplified again, with different elements surviving or disappearing at each stage. Enki's descent is one of the additions that survived every stage. He is present in the Eridu Genesis, in the Atrahasis, in the Gilgamesh flood. His role changes in detail, but not in function. He is always the one who says no without saying no. His presence across all three versions, in a tradition where so much else was modified or removed, suggests that the figure of the dissenting divine intelligence was too fundamental to the story's meaning to eliminate. The flood narrative required Enki's subversion to make sense of the survival. Atrahasis could not have lived without someone in the divine council who disagreed enough to act. Whatever else was simplified or removed, that remained, because without it, the story had no mechanism. The god who kept saying no was too necessary to erase. What was erased, repeatedly, was the record of what exactly he said no to. The cities that fought in heaven, the pattern, the investigation, has been tracing a hero's city replacing a rival city's deity in the hero role. A political transition encoded in a mythological revision is not confined to the Ningirsu to Ninurta substitution in the Anzu tradition. It appears across the cuneiform record in a form that, once identified, becomes difficult to unsee. The Sumerian city-state system of the late 3rd millennium BC was a political environment of intense intercity competition. Lagash and Umma fought over a border region called the Gu-Idina. For generations, the Still of the Vultures records one episode in a conflict that the cuneiform inscriptions document across at least 5 separate rulers of Lagash. Kish claimed a form of primacy over the northern cities. Dominated the south, Nippur, though never a major military power, occupied a unique position as the religious centre of Sumerian civilization, the city of Enlil, the location of the Ekur temple complex that was considered the earthly dwelling of the divine assembly's chief. Control of Nippur carried a theological legitimacy that military power alone could not provide, and the city-states that achieved regional dominance consistently sought Nippur's endorsement. The divine assembly's geography reflected the human political map. Each major city had its patron deity. Lagash had Ningirsu, Ur had Nana the moon god, Uruk had Inanna, Eridu had Enki, Nippur had Enlil and Ninurta. The political fortunes of the city were understood as expressions of the divine favour its patron deity commanded within the divine assembly. When Lagash's power declined relative to Nippur's institutional influence, the mythological consequence was the revision of the Anzu tradition, replacing Lagash's divine champion with Nippur's. The cities that fought in heaven were fighting in the cuneiform record, and the cuneiform record was the mechanism through which the outcomes of those fights were formalized and transmitted. This is most clearly documented in a text that falls slightly outside the central divine war tradition, but that illuminates the political mechanics of mythological revision with unusual precision. The composition scholars call the Curse of Agade, preserved in multiple Nippur exemplars and analysed by Gerald Cooper in his 1983 monograph, The Curse of Agade, records the destruction of the city of Agade, capital of the Akkadian Empire, as the consequence of a divine decision. The Emperor Naram Sin, the text claims, committed sacrilege against the Eka temple at Nippur, and the gods convening in assembly voted to curse Agade and raise the Gutian mountain peoples against it. Cooper's analysis established that the Curse of Agade is a Nippur composition, probably produced during the Year 3 period. Its political purpose is legible. It explains the fall of the Akkadian Empire, a historical event, archaeologically documented, that ended Akkadian dominance over Mesopotamia as the direct consequence of offending Nippur. The city whose religious authority the Akkadians had subordinated to imperial politics is, in this text, the city whose divine patron executed the empire's destruction. The divine assembly vote in the Curse of a God is not the investigations. Primary evidence it falls outside the divine war tradition proper but it is the clearest documented case of a Nippur scribal institution producing a mythological narrative in which the divine council's decision directly served Nippur's political interest. The assembly voted. The vote went Nippur's way. The historical loser was identified as the one who had offended the gods at Nippur's temple. The pattern is not incidental. It is the mechanism by which the mythological record and the political record remained in productive alignment. Cities that achieved dominance produced scribal institutions that retroactively encoded that dominance in the divine tradition, and cities that lost dominance found their divine representatives repositioned within the hierarchy as rivals, as subordinates, or, in Lagash's most complete case, as absences. The war the investigation has been tracing was not only fought in the divine world, it was fought in the scribal schools, in the editorial decisions of copying and transmission, in the selection of which version of the Anzu myth received institutional endorsement and which was kept in a provincial archive in Susa where the Nippur canonical tradition's reach was incomplete. The cities that fought in heaven were fighting in the clay, and the clay was the battlefield that determined which version of the fight survived. What Inanna's war reveals there is one major figure in the Sumerian divine assembly who has been conspicuously absent from this investigation, and that absence is itself a form of evidence. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and the morning and evening star, patron of Uruk, one of the most widely attested deities in the entire Mesopotamian tradition, appears in more surviving cuneiform texts than any other Sumerian deity except Enlil. Her mythological corpus includes the descent of Inanna to the underworld, her conflict with the mountain god Ebich documented in the composition Inanna and Ebi, her acquisition of the divine powers called the Mi in the story of Inanna and Enki, and a body of hymnic literature, much of it attributed to the historical priestess Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, writing approximately 2300 BC, that represents the oldest identified authored literary corpus in human history. Inanna is absent from this investigation because she is almost entirely absent from the Anunnaki Divine Council tradition as it appears in the war texts examined here. She does not appear in the Igigi rebellion, she does not appear in the Anzu myth, she is not among the divine assembly members who vote for the flood. She is not involved in the Lugal-Ease conflict or the stone judgment. Her absence from the divine war tradition is so consistent that it cannot be accidental. What it most likely reflects is a structural feature of the Sumerian divine organization that the war texts encode in their very architecture. The Anunnaki Council, as it appears in the Atrahasis, the Anzu myth, and the Lugal-E, is a governing body dominated by male deities arranged in a patrilineal hierarchy, Anu at the apex, Enlil as chief executive, Enki as the senior dissenting intelligence, Ninurta as the warrior champion, with Nusku and other ministerial figures in supporting roles. Inanna, whose divine domain included war, but whose institutional position in the divine assembly was complex and contested, operates in a parallel mythological tradition that intersects with, but does not integrate cleanly into the council war tradition. Her own war text, Inanna and Ebi, is instructive in this regard. The composition analysed by Gerald Cooper in a 1971 paper in the Journal of the American Oriental Society and fully treated in William Hallow and J.J.A. Van Dyck's 1968 Yale edition records Inanna's military campaign against the mountain Ebi, a geographical region in the Zagros Mountains that had refused to acknowledge her divine authority. The divine assembly appears in this text, but in a supporting role, Inanna goes to An and asks for authorization for her campaign. An, in an unusual moment for the divine patriarch, declines. He warns her that Ebi is too dangerous. Inanna ignores the warning and attacks anyway. She wins. Ebi is defeated. The mountain that the patriarch of the divine assembly said was too dangerous to fight is destroyed by the goddess, who didn't ask for his permission. The text is attributed to Enheduanna, which dates its composition in at least this form to approximately 2300 BC, making it among the oldest surviving literary compositions with an identified author. And what it records is a goddess conducting a unilateral military campaign that the divine assembly's patriarch explicitly advised against, winning and suffering no institutional consequence for the insubordination. The implications for the picture of the Anunnaki Divine Council assembled here are significant. The council that panicked during the Ijigi rebellion, that sent champions one by one to their refusal during the Anzu crisis, that voted for the flood without understanding that it would make the gods themselves hungry, this same council is bypassed entirely by its most militarily assertive member, who goes to war on her own authority after the patriarch tells her not to, and returns victorious. Inanna's absence from the council war tradition and her parallel existence in a tradition where she operates largely outside the council's authority structure suggests that the Anunnaki assembly, as depicted in the texts examined here, was not the only governing structure in the Sumerian divine world. There were divine forces, Inanna being the most visible, whose relationship to the assembly was more negotiated than subordinate, who could invoke council authority when it was useful and ignore it when it was not, and whose military operations did not require assembly authorization to proceed. The war tradition examined in this investigation depicts a council governing itself, its internal conflicts, its labour rebellions, its coup attempts, its flood vote, and its subverted aftermath. Inanna's tradition depicts a divine force operating in parallel to that council, neither fully within its authority structure nor fully outside it, conducting her own campaigns on her own timeline. The divine world in the Sumerian texts is not, in this composite picture, a single hierarchical institution. It is at minimum two overlapping authority structures, the Anunnaki Council tradition and the Inanna tradition, with distinct memberships, distinct decision-making processes, and distinct relationships to the concept of divine authorization. The wars recorded in each tradition are, in some structural sense, wars conducted in different governing systems that happen to share a cosmological address. The language the gods used before Babel there is a Sumerian composition that almost never appears in discussions of divine conflict, possibly because its surface content, a myth explaining why the world has many languages, seems too etiological to carry the political weight this investigation has been tracking. Its Sumerian title is Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, and it is one of the longest surviving Sumerian literary compositions, running to approximately 600 lines across multiple exemplars from the Nippur collection. The text concerns a diplomatic and military contest between two cities, Uruk, ruled by the historical or semi-historical king Enmerkar, and Aratta, a city in the highlands, probably in what is now Iran, whose identification with any archaeologically known site remains contested. The contest is conducted partly through messengers, partly through riddles, and partly through appeals to divine intervention. At its climax, Enmerkar appeals to Enki, and Enki, in a passage that Samuel Noah Kramer identified in his 1944 analysis as one of the most theologically significant in the entire Sumerian corpus, changes the languages of the world. In what had been a single language world, Enki introduces multilingualism. The passage describes the unified language being disturbed the peoples of Sumer, Subur, Hamazi, and the lands surrounding them, who had previously spoken one tongue, now speaking different ones. The text locates this event in the context of a divine competition between Uruk and Aratta for commercial and political supremacy, with Enki's intervention serving Uruk's interests. The standard scholarly reading, as established by Kramer and as developed in more recent work by Bent Auster and others, treats this passage as an etiological myth, a narrative explanation for the observed fact of linguistic diversity rendered in the political frame of an intercity competition. That reading is correct as far as it goes. What it does not fully account for is the structural role the language change plays within the Divine Council tradition. Enki changes the languages of the world unilaterally, without convening the assembly, without a vote, without even the formal procedure of seeking authorization from Enlil that the Atrahasis narrative shows was standard for major cosmic decisions. He acts on his own authority, the same pattern as his subversion of the flood vote, the same pattern as his entrapment of Ninurta, the same pattern as his secret communication with Atrahasis through the reed hut walls. Enki's consistent mode of operation is unilateral intervention in situations where the formal decision-making apparatus of the Divine Council is either absent, moving too slowly, or moving in a direction he intends to subvert. The significance of this for the war tradition is not in the language change itself, but in what it reveals about Enki's operational independence from the assembly. A figure who can change the fundamental linguistic structure of the human world without convening the Divine Council is not a member of that council in any conventional sense. He is a power that operates alongside the council, using its authority when convenient and bypassing it when not. The assembly that voted unanimously for the flood did not vote on the language change. The cosmic decision that made all subsequent human communication across cultural boundaries more difficult was made by one god without deliberation, in service of one city's commercial interests. The connection to the war tradition lies here. If Enki could restructure fundamental aspects of the human world without assembly authorization, then the assembly's authority was not actually the supreme governing mechanism of the Sumerian cosmos. It was one mechanism among several, operating in parallel with the independent authority of figures like Enki and Inanna, whose divine domains gave them operational autonomy that the assembly's formal procedures could not fully contain. The war that the investigation has been tracing the Divine Council's internal conflicts, its labour rebellions, its flood vote, its contested post-war settlements, was a war conducted within one governing structure. The structure was real and consequential. It was also incomplete. Beside it operated divine forces whose authority did not ultimately derive from the Assembly's vote, and whose decisions the Assembly could not fully control. That is a more complicated picture of divine governance than any single text in the Sumerian corpus presents. It is also a more accurate picture of what the corpus, read in composite, actually contains. The tablet that named the silence in 1953, the Assyriologist Adam Falkenstein published a study in the journal Zeitschrift for Assyriology examining a category of Sumerian literary text that had received relatively little scholarly attention, the so-called lament compositions, long poetic texts mourning the destruction of Sumerian cities that had fallen to military conquest or famine or divine abandonment. The laments, the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer, and the lamentation over the destruction of the Nippur lament, the Eridu lament, were canonical texts in the Nippur scribal school curriculum. They were copied, taught, and transmitted with the same institutional care as the mythological compositions examined throughout this investigation. Falkenstein's analysis established something about the laments that subsequent scholars, including Thorkild Jacobson in The Treasures of Darkness and Samuel Noah Kramer in various studies, have developed with increasing precision. The laments are not simply expressions of grief. They are theological documents that work to explain why the gods permitted the destruction of their own cities. Their answer, consistently, is that the Anunnaki Divine Council voted for the destruction that the Assembly convened, deliberated, and resolved that a particular city should fall, and that the gods who had previously protected that city were instructed by the Assembly to abandon their posts. The lamentation over the destruction of its primary source, a tablet held in the Penn Museum, with additional exemplars in the Istanbul Archaeological Museums and the British Museum, describes the fall of the Ur-3 state in approximately 2004 BC in precise procedural terms. The assembly gathered, the decree was spoken. Nanna, the moon god who was Ur's divine patron, attempted to intercede to argue before Anu and Enlil for the city's preservation. He was denied, the decree stood, the city fell. What the lament tradition preserves is a theological framework that makes the Divine Assembly's decisions historically consequential in a testable way. Real cities fell, real populations suffered, and the explanation offered by the scribal tradition is that the Assembly voted for it. The laments are the genre in which the Anunnaki Council's decisions most clearly intersect with archaeologically documentable events. We can date the fall of Ur. We can locate the Nanna intercession narrative in the text. The gap between the event and its theological interpretation is measurable. The gap is not comfortable. The Ur-3 state fell to the Amorite peoples and the Elamites' military and demographic pressures that modern archaeology can trace in the material record. The lament tradition explains the same event as a divine assembly vote. Both explanations are present in the record. The question the lament tradition implicitly poses without answering is what the relationship between the divine assembly's decision and the human military situation was understood to be. Did the assembly vote, and then the Elamites arrived as the instrument of that vote, or did the Elamites arrive, and then the assembly's vote explain retrospectively why the gods had not prevented it? The laments do not resolve this. They are not required to. Their function is theological, not causal. They establish that what happened was divinely sanctioned, that the destruction was not a failure of divine protection, but an expression of divine decision. The assembly voted. The city fell. The theological framework absorbs both facts. What the lament tradition adds to the investigation's picture is this: the divine assembly's war-making capacity was not confined to mythological time. It extended, in the theological understanding of the Sumerian scribal tradition, into historical time, into the documented falls of real cities, the defeats of real armies, the displacements of real populations. The divine council that had voted for the extinction of humanity in the Atrahasis narrative was the same institution in the scribal tradition's understanding that voted for the destruction of in approximately 2004 BC. The war the investigation has been tracing did not end with the flood, or with Ninurta's campaign against the stones, or with Enki's entrapment of the divine hero in a pit. It continued in the lament tradition's framework into the historical period, into the documented collapses of the city-state system, into the events that the cuneiform record preserves in both mythological and administrative form. The silence, the investigation's title, invokes the deletions, the revisions, the strategic absences extended. In other words, not just into the divine past, but into the human present of the scribal tradition that preserved it. The tablet that named the silence was not a single text. It was the gap between the lament's theological explanation and the archaeological record's causal one between the assembly's vote and the Elamites' spears, between what the divine council decided and what happened next in the dirt. The edge of the known corpus, the honest boundary of this investigation, is not a dramatic one. It does not end at a wall of institutional secrecy or at the locked cabinet of a museum that has chosen not to display certain tablets. It ends where all careful work of this kind ends, at the edge of what the available evidence, worked with the available scholarly tools, can support. The cuneiform record is vast and it is damaged. The Penn Museum's Nippur collection runs to approximately 30,000 tablets, many of them fragmentary, many not yet fully published. The Istanbul share of the same excavation is of comparable size. The British Museum holds cuneiform material from multiple 19th century excavation programs, some of it catalogued but incompletely studied. The Iraq Museum's holdings before 2003 included material from every major Mesopotamian site excavated under the Ottoman administration and the subsequent Iraqi Antiquities Authority, a collection whose full contents were never comprehensively published and whose post-2003 condition remains, incompletely assessed despite ongoing recovery work. Behind the specific texts examined in this investigation, the Atrahasis, the Anzu myth, the Lugal-E, the King List, the Eridu Genesis, Ninurta and the Turtle, the Laments, Inanna and Ebi, Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, lies an unknown quantity of cuneiform composition that has not been worked sufficiently to yield clear evidence, What that material contains is genuinely unknown. It may contain additional pieces of the picture assembled here. It may contain pieces that alter the picture. It may contain entirely separate traditions whose relationship to the war narrative is not yet visible. The specific probability that deserves attention is this: the texts that survived into the canonical Aduba curriculum, the texts that were copied by multiple scribal schools across multiple centuries, are precisely the texts most likely to have undergone the editorial refinements this investigation has been tracking. The texts that did not make the canonical curriculum, that survived in single copies in peripheral archives, that waited in Istanbul for 69 years after their photograph appeared on a book cover those texts, are precisely the ones most likely to have escaped the directional pressure toward divine dignity and divine harmony that the canonical transmission exerted. Ni 12501 is one such text. Its uniqueness, the fact that it has no parallel in the known corpus, is the signature of a text that the canonical scribal schools did not find worth reproducing. The Susa version of the Anzu myth is another. Preserved in a provincial archive rather than a canonical school, it retained the hero's ambivalence that the Nineveh version had refined into unambiguous loyalty. The peripheral texts are, in this specific sense, the ones most likely to have preserved what the centre preferred to modify. This means that the investigation's conclusions, the picture of a volatile divine council, a dissenting intelligence operating through indirection, a war whose costs were contested across 80 incompatible exemplars, are almost certainly conservative. The evidence assembled here comes from the canonical tradition and its documented variants. The non-canonical material, the peripheral archives, the unread tablets, if they follow the pattern that the Susa Anzu version and Ni 12501 have established, they are more likely to complicate the canonical picture than to confirm it. The edge of the known corpus is not the edge of what happened. It is the edge of what the institutional tradition found worth preserving in a form we can read. Beyond it, in the collections that have been catalogued but not translated, in the archives that have not been fully excavated, in the tablets that did not survive the circumstances of the past 4,000 years, is a record that may never be fully recovered. The investigation ends here, not because the evidence has been exhausted, but because the evidence available has been followed as far as it goes, without speculation overtaking documentation. The pattern identified editorial revision, directionally consistent toward divine authority and away from divine vulnerability, across multiple independent texts and multiple independent scribal traditions, is documented. The specific mechanisms, the Aduba curriculum's selective preservation, the political encoding of city-state competition in divine narrative, the formal compliance and practical subversion that characterises Enki's relationship to the assembly are documented. The specific recent evidence that the archive continues to yield Metasak's 2025 translation of Ni 2501 is documented. What lies beyond the edge is genuine uncertainty, not the performed uncertainty of an investigation that knows more than it says, and not the false certainty of one that says more than it knows. Genuine uncertainty, the condition of careful work at the boundary of available evidence, where the next tablet to be fully translated may confirm the picture, complicate it, or open a direction the investigation has not anticipated. The clay is still being read. The stylus marks are still clear. The hand that pressed them into the soft material of an afternoon 600 years ago, or 4,000, or perhaps further back than that, in layers the archive has not yet revealed, that hand is still speaking, in the only language it has left, to anyone patient enough to learn how to listen. The assembly is still in session. It has never fully adjourned. The record of its proceedings is incomplete, contested, partially revised, and still arriving one careful translation at a time. From collections in cities the scribes of Nippur and Sippar and Susa never imagined, read by eyes using tools the clay could not have anticipated, in a world the divine council of the Anunnaki would not have recognised as the one they were fighting over. And yet here we are, still arguing about what the gods decided, still piecing together the votes from the fragments of the tablets that recorded them, still finding in the gap between one version and another, in the line that was kept and the line that was changed, the outline of something that someone, in some city, in some century, between then and now, decided the world did not need to see clearly. The archive disagrees. It always has. It keeps saying so, one tablet at a time.